Welcome to the Product Design Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Coelen, founder of UX Cabin, where we create world-class web and mobile apps. I'm excited to bring you a behind-the-scenes look into the lives of some of the most interesting and talented people in product design. We'll get strategic advice on how they got to where they are today and things they wish they would have known earlier in their career. Hey, thanks for checking out the Product Design Podcast. Today, we have Ahmad Kadhim living in Montreal. He is the co-founder and VP of product at 3RM, a Web3 startup. And we're here to talk about your journey and the Figma acquisition and some crypto Web3 type products and things coming out of the space. Got a full slate of things to talk about. So yeah, man, great to have you here. Why don't you just, tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me on. So it's a pleasure to be here. So, I go by AK. Feel free to call me that. And, I got started in the tech space like 10 years ago or close to 10 years ago. And I've been building a music blog when I was in university. And so I really got into the idea of building websites, building apps. And I started to get frustrated with WordPress. So I went to a tech bootcamp. And it was the idea of bootcamps were just starting at the time. This one was called BitMaker. And learned web development, got a job at an agency downtown Toronto. And I kind of launched this 10-year tech career. And, I started out as a developer for a few years, but working in a lot of startups, I was always leaning toward the design side of things. Being a front-end developer in startups kind of usually automatically means you are the designer. And so I started to fall in love with that part of the work and little by little transitioned over with each role taking on more design work. And then, focused on design work for a while. I was at 500px for a short time, but while I was there, I built a design system. So I got really nerdy about design systems for a couple of years. And most recently, I was at a product at Activate Staff where we built a staffing platform. And so that was my introduction to more product management side of things. Still doing a lot of design work, but that's kind of where I transitioned into a blend of product management with a design background.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I think you are not alone in being frustrated with WordPress. So that's pretty cool. That kind of spurred you on to go to a boot camp and try to figure things out that way. Would love to know just how your experience with the boot camp was, if you think that's still a good model to go down and maybe some of the pros and cons of that approach.
Totally. I mean, when I first got into that boot camp, I was for the first time in my life, an educational experience felt like what it should be.
Wow.
For my entire school, university, I was so let down by learning a bunch of things that weren't applicable in real life and, very esoteric topics that I can't even remember what I learned anymore. And it just didn't feel like it had the culture of let's just actually do something. Let's build something and let's get into that right now. And the intensive nature of it was also really enlivening. Because it's kind of I was in a fraternity in university. So you get this kind of sense of we're 30 of us, we're working here 8 to 12 hours a day. We're all together, and you get that camaraderie with everyone else in the cohort. So I still think it's an amazing model. And things kind of came full circle for me when I, a few years later, started teaching design at the same boot camp that I developed. And so I led the UX and product design program there for a couple of years, and it got acquired by General Assembly. So we kind of integrated into them before I moved on.
Really cool. If someone is to take a boot camp, is that something that people can do realistically part-time, or do they kind of have to devote all of their energy to it to get the most out of it?
They have both part-time and full-time options, but they serve different people, different.
Yeah.
So the part-time program is maybe you're already in the tech industry, or maybe you're just sort of interested and curious and you'd like to kind of just add on to your skill set. And the full-time program is you want to be a designer, you want to be a developer, and that's what you're coming out to do.
Gotcha. So if you hadn't done that boot camp, do you think you would have tried to pursue learning on your own or going about it some different way? Or did that really give you kind of the learning path to say okay, this is development, here's design and all these other fields that I could potentially go into? Would you say that kind of unlocked your learning path from where you wanted to go from there?
Definitely did. I mean, this was 2013, so this was also a perfect time to get into web development. It was really hot in demand. And I don't think, even though I was struggling along with learning HTML and CSS and a bit of jQuery on my own, I wasn't really getting that far with it. So getting to experience like, what does a real web development stack look like? And what do you actually have to know end to end, full stack to understand the whole process? I don't know how long it would have taken me, and I might have got discouraged along the way.
Totally. Totally. So as we think about your career from that bootcamp experience to then getting into your first job, what was the transition like from like going from bootcamp to trying to apply? Was it like an easy experience? It sounds like you got kind of put on a smaller team where you could do a lot of things. What was your strategy in finding your first gig out of bootcamp?
I've actually been meaning to tell this story, so I'm so glad you asked. It was in the boot camp. At that point, it was 9 weeks. And the last 2 weeks were the final project where you're supposed to, take everything you learned, have your own idea, maybe work together with a few people. And I started to work from a coffee shop that was like across the street from my place. And this was in Toronto, like in the kind of like area where there's a lot of tech firms, a lot of startups, Spadina and Adelaide. And there was this one coffee shop on, at the floor of the building there. And I started going every day. It was just like my corner coffee shop. And I started speaking to the barista one day, and I was telling her what I was up to. And I was like coding websites every day at the coffee shop. But she was like, hey, you realize that there's like a lot of tech people walking through here every day for lunch and coffee. Like, why don't you just put up a sign that you're looking for a job? And I was like, that's a pretty cool idea. But I don't know, like, could that work? And she was like, just try it, like, so she gave me a piece of paper and some markers, and I just like wrote a bunch of funny things on the back of my laptop. Like first I just put like, hire me, JavaScript, Ruby on Rails developer, like the technical stuff. And then I put like weird things. Like I was like Usain Bolt on a keyboard, like really good DJ, like sunny disposition. I just started putting all kinds of like funny things in different colored markers.
On your laptop?
I stuck it on the back of my laptop. And every day at lunch from like 12 to 2 at this coffee shop, they had a really good lunch. There would be a lineup of people kind of like in front of where I would be sitting, and then on my right towards the cashier. And so like I did this at 11:30 when she suggested it. As soon as people started coming in for 12, people were like, hey, we're actually hiring, here's my card. Let me know.
No way.
By the end of that lunch rush, by 2 p.m., I had like 20 cards. And someone walked in at 2 p.m. with like 2 other, people with him, and saw my sign, started chatting to me, and was like, what are you doing right now? I was like, nothing. Like, do you have time to come in for an interview or just around the corner? Like, yeah, sure. And so I did this for 2 weeks, for like just over a week and a half. The first interview, that one, like they wanted someone more technical than I was ready to be. But a week later, someone, same situation. And I by this time I had like 200 cards. And someone comes in and checks in and is like, hey, I actually work for the agency on the top floor. We're looking for front-end developers, let's talk, like, come on in. And by the end of the 9-week program, I walked in on my last day, and instead of the final project, I was like, hey guys, I got a job. So thanks. See ya.
That is amazing. So you're literally like a billboard in the coffee shop, and the money you paid for coffee and lunch was probably worth its weight in gold.
Definitely.
Wow. I'm curious if you could replicate that in other instances, but that is a really good origin story for breaking into tech.
Yeah, what was also really funny about it is that I got about as many offers for marketing jobs, because they were like, you clearly know how to market yourself. We're at a
wow.
You can see around the corner. Would you be interested? I was like, that's tempting, but like not quite, but like definitely for marketing people, I'd say give it a shot, see what happens.
Wow. That's really cool. Yeah. I've seen a bunch of different like creative ways to get your name in front of people. Like, you send the team lead or the hiring manager like a cake with your resume printed on it, like delivered right to them, or just like really creative ways. So I think, yeah, depending on what type of gig you're going for, you could kind of lean into that and really make an impact. No, but that's cool. Like, yeah, maybe take us back a little bit and fill us in a little bit on before the boot camp. What were you doing for school or work, or what did you think you wanted to pursue before all of this?
Yeah, I had a winding road towards this. So I started out at Tufts University doing biopsychology on a pre-med track. And, I think what motivated me there is I was just really fascinated by like how we are the way we are, why we behave the way we do. And that combination of biology, genetics, and psychology felt like a really interesting lens on that. But, after 2 years, I realized I was like, I like studying this, but I don't want to be a doctor. I actually just want, like, I was just curious about the subject. And so I switched into financial economics. And that was in my mind at the time was like thinking I want to be more entrepreneurial. Part of the reason I didn't want to be a doctor was, I didn't want to spend like the rest of my 20s, 100 hours a week in a hospital kind of
Right.
lifestyle. Like I wanted something more flexible. And so I thought like entrepreneurial angle, I did financial economics and that's what I graduated with. And the finance part was really useful. The finance part, like till now, I still have those fundamental skills that come handy, but the economics part kind of ended up being a bit BS. Like the academic economics is very
Right.
different than real life. I
Right.
see that every day in what the Fed is doing. Uh, so yeah, that's kind of how I knew like by the end of university or a year before I was supposed to graduate, I was like kind of already falling out of love with what I was studying. And that's what pushed me into thinking about tech.
Wow. Yeah, that's super cool. Everyone has a really interesting winding path, especially kind of in the earlier days as UX was kind of forming to the surface of its own
Mhm.
unique discipline. So, thinking over the course of your career, your positions that you've held, the companies that you've worked for, do you have any like specific highs and lows that you can remember?
Yeah, totally. There was this one really interesting moment at my first startup job. So I'd been working for about a year. I joined the startup called Receiver. And I think at that point, like I coasted through most of school just by having like a decent memory and the ability to pass a test. And the first agency job I did was like I was still getting my feet, so kind of wasn't as high of expectations on my role. And then this first startup job was like, you're four people and you're like, here's you build the front end, and I'm like, okay, that's a lot. And I think I didn't really match the energy, the work ethic of the other co-founders, and they started to notice that within like a couple of weeks. So the CEO founder pulled me aside one day and just like, hey, like we're not really seeing what we want to see from you. Like this is, if you think about everyone else here, like they're sacrificing so much. They've got other obligations in their life that are, like that they're putting on hold, and they're really giving everything they can to this. And I feel like you're not treating it that same way. And so then me in that moment, I was like, oh, like I love this work that I'm doing. I love this team. I like what we're building, but I totally see it that I'm not really giving it that same level of commitment. And just like in that one moment, like something flipped in my head and I was like, hey, look, like I'm really sorry. And I want to show you that commitment. I want to show that energy you're talking about. I completely understand. And like overnight, I started working like 12 hours a day, like just like immediately, just like flip the switch. And my work ethic has like generally followed that like moment where I just like,
Wow.
switched. Like, so from, something just clicked in my brain. Like my whole life, I haven't really worked very hard to get by. And then in that moment, I just like felt the energy of everyone else in the room, like giving it their all and like just matched it.
Yeah. So this is kind of like I don't know if you would say like coming of age or but definitely like a transition point where it was like you just kind of went into like overdrive and really found your footing as like someone who could really work hard and grind and push through. Um,
Totally.
and you enjoyed that, like, going forward, like the long term, like, would you say that that was kind of rewarding and fulfilling for you going forward?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's not like I work 12 hours every single day, but like when the time is right and the conditions are there, then I'm happy to do it. And I don't feel like it's work. I still feel happy at the end of the day. I think
Yeah.
that's the key thing. It's like, you can walk out of a 12-hour day feeling defeated, or you can walk out of it feeling euphoric. And it's just about, how do you feel about your work, your team, what you're doing?
Yeah. I think it's a really good point because, like, on one hand, you have like hustle culture. That's just like, you should work all the time. Like, it's the most important thing. And then on the very flip side, you have like, uh, do not do anything outside of your pay grade. Like, don't do any extra work, don't do this or that or whatever. And like, I think both extremes are unhealthy, right? But there is something to be said of like, hey, if you put in your 10,000 hours to like master something, and hoping it's not just, throwaway work, or it's something that can actually benefit you, like, the faster that you can get to that point, that's generally going to always benefit you. And I think in my life, there have been seasons where it's like, okay, for this period of time, it makes sense to just grind. Like, I'm going to put everything into this, and I'm going to say no to a lot of other things, but I'm going to like achieve this thing. I'm going to see this through. And there's been other times where like I need like a serious amount of work like balance, and I literally can't do anything outside of like the normal work hours, or even a little less. So I think I think there's a healthy balance there that you have to like, you can't just be 100% hustle culture, or 100% like, you know I'm trying to act my wage, or whatever you want to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely different when you're an employee at a mature company. I wouldn't expect people to do that. That's just not fair. And the companies should
Yeah,
be well funded enough to give everyone a healthy balance. But it's more in those times when, you're in a small, tight knit team, you're trying to build something from nothing. And that's where it really pays off and makes the difference, and feels great because you're building something that you set out to build in
totally.
your own motivation.
Yeah, like, yeah, maybe it's a side project, or maybe you are working a career that you don't really like, and you're trying to break into UX or front end dev, or product design. It's like, okay, when you get home, you got 4 to 6 hours of side projects. That's well worth the investment, depending on your lifestyle and everything like that.
And I've had a backfire as well. Like, speaking of like lows in my career, like I've had a backfire where at my previous startup, as I was head of product at Activate, and we had a pretty tough year after COVID hit because we lost one of our major customers that was providing most of our early revenue. And we kind of had the market kind of shut out from us for a while. Like, our customers weren't looking to buy new software for most of 2020. And it was a really tough time because we were underfunded. We were each trying to cover a variety of roles, keep the startup alive, keep it going. And, I reached a point where I was working crazy hours and trying to fill in all the gaps, but eventually hit a point of burnout by the like November of that year. And of course, like, in a year where we couldn't go out, where we couldn't see our
Yeah,
clients, it just compounded all of it. So I was like hyper efficient. I was getting so much stuff done. And then at some point I started to get foggy, slow down, not really be able to. I put in the hours, but it wouldn't lead to much. And then I started to get irritable and not feel like, on the same page as my colleagues. And like, after I recognized, I was like, okay, this is like a chronic burnout. This isn't something I can just like take a few days off and feel better. Like, it's going to take longer than that. And then, ultimately it did take me something like 3 to 6 months to recover from that place. So,
really.
yeah, absolutely. My teammates stepped in where they could. We finally started to get a few new customers that helped unlock a few things. But for a while, it was just kind of this like grinding to a fault, but not really seeing any other option in that scenario. Just like not sure what to do. And, maybe now I'd have a bit of advice for myself of like better awareness of when I get to that point, because ultimately whatever productivity I gain by working harder now, if that's offset by like 3 months of being like kind of just out of it, it wouldn't be worth it in the long run.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So was it mainly just like rest that you needed, or like not thinking about anything, or how did you kind of recover from burnout in that time period then?
Well, I mean, I definitely learned a lot about delegation. I definitely learned a lot about how to train people to take on things that they weren't yet ready to take on, but to give them the chance to fail. I think that's a big mistake I was making as a manager for the first time. I'd been managing at that point for 2 years, but not a very large team. And so I wasn't really used to like, passing on my expertise in a way that I could really
Wow.
focus
Yeah.
on delegation as the main part of, my work. And, that definitely taught me a lot. Like, okay, my job isn't just to do stuff. My job is to make sure everyone else can do it too.
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. I think that's a really good point. Looking back, what are some of the things that you would look back and be like, okay, I should have seen this as a red flag of like, I'm starting to get burnt out, that you would know now after coming through it?
Just starting out with like low energy, needing a lot of caffeine to compensate, getting a bit irritable, I think one of the big signals is like not wanting to talk to friends, not wanting to talk to people in my personal life because I would just want to like vegetate at the end of the day. It's like when I was hitting that point, I think that's a pretty strong signal.
Yeah. Yeah. There's been times for me where it's like, I find that if I am not able to sleep or go to bed because I'm like anxiously thinking about the work or the business or like the next day, then for me, that's starting to edge on like a little bit unhealthy, where it's like, if this is like a sustained pattern of like, I'm having anxiousness or trouble sleeping because of the business, it's like something is out of whack, whether it's my point of view or it's how much I'm giving attention to this or how much work I'm giving to this. That's kind of like a telltale sign for me. And I wouldn't say I've ever been like super burnt out, but more so just kind of like needing some reorientation and balance within the weeks or months. And I think everyone's different. Like I was just listening to the Mr. Beast, the YouTuber, like how he works. And he's like, I literally just work 24/7 until I'm burnt out. And then I take a break until I want to work again. And like, I legitimately think his mode, his best, life for him is to like probably work upwards of like 16 hours a day until he can't do it anymore. And then take a break until he feels like the strong urge to come back and work again.
But yeah, that's really interesting. That intense rest, intense work. Like I could see it working. I mean, I think part of the thing that broke down for me in 2020 was, before that, I'd been doing a lot of traveling and working remotely. So there was always this sense of like, waking up in a new city every couple of weeks and like being energized by the place, going out. And so even if I was still working a lot on the road, but, was balancing out with like meeting new people, going out to fun parties, being on the beach. And then when COVID kind of shut down a lot of those possibilities, I think that's when like there was no longer the counterbalancing.
Totally. The perfect storm. Yeah. So, thinking about all of your career and your journey, what would you give as advice to people who are either A, looking to get into the space, or B, just general career insight, from your path?
Yeah. I mean, depending on what you're interested in, I think it makes a lot of sense to just start contributing in whatever little ways you can. And I know, like, let's say as a developer, there's a lot more opportunities to contribute to open source projects, whereas designers maybe struggle to not really have anything meaningful to do until they're actually assigned like work that is, has a user at the other side of it.
Sure.
So like, just like side projects, I know it's really good to be able to showcase your skills, but because they're detached from reality, it's a little bit hard to use that to get a job on its own. So I'd say one of the things I suggest for people in that case is like picking up freelance work just to hone your skills, to kind of sharpen it up. And that's like starting with friends and family. And it might not be the most interesting, exciting work, but it's something. And another is something, honestly, like I only just started thinking more strategically about this like 4 months ago, is building your social presence and starting to make a name for yourself online, starting to just talk, frequently, like tweeting, LinkedIn posting, whatever your medium of choice is. I don't think it matters as much, but just, curating that and giving that personal brand that people know who you are, what you stand for within like a few seconds of seeing your profile. you know, I think that's something I never took seriously for like most of my career until very recently. I just thought like, I do the work and my work speaks for itself. Well, no, it
Right.
doesn't, because then no one's going to know or care what you did.
Right. Yeah, and the funny thing is with like social stuff, you never know what is going to like take off. And I've had things where I've written out a tweet where I'm like, this is like the best thought I've ever had about this particular thing. Like, this is gonna like go crazy and gonna be awesome. And then it gets like 9 likes or whatever. And you're like, what? Why didn't this go? And then other things where I just like literally like in 30 seconds, like rifle off something. And then I come back the next day and I'm like, holy cow, like 1,000 retweets. Like what is going on? So it's just like, you got to take your shot. You never know what's going to resonate or who's going to see something. And I think, it makes sense to make, appropriate time investment to create these posts and these content, not necessarily just consume, but like put a little thought into uh, what's something interesting I can say about X, Y, or Z. Like maybe it's form fields, or maybe it's logins, or maybe it's just like just random niche topic. Like maybe you've been working on something for, a quarter. It's like, well, there's something interesting you can talk about this that can provide value, and just giving a little thought to that. And yeah, you never know. Could go a long way. Could get the right eyeballs on it. Could, land you your next opportunity. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah. I never know which of my tweets are going to work. Like I thought I did. I can't possibly imagine now, like how this works, but it just keep going and something hits, and then, maybe you develop an intuition for it over time, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think to your point on like just doing either freelance work, friends or family type things, I also think there's like a big opportunity to just like make little micro design files for the Figma community. So like social login buttons. I don't know. There's just like a ton of different things. If you can just like make it in a nice way with auto layout, with components, post it up on the Figma community. Maybe it's a really small UI kit, or maybe it's like a style tile library, or there's probably a million different things. But doing that type of thing not only gives you like credibility in the space, it could also gain you some followers or notoriety in your specific space. So I think, even if you don't have particular paying work, there's things that you can do, that you can put out there that provide value and help move your career along, 1 inch at a time.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I've definitely found a lot of people through free resources.
Definitely. Cool. So maybe we can transition a little bit into one of the topics that we wanted to talk about here with the recent Figma acquisition. I know when that happened a few weeks back, the design Twitter and design internet side of things just kind of melted down in a beautiful, spectacular roasting of memes and the like. I wanted to get your initial reaction on the acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, first things I thought were just holy shit, like, like wow, 20 billion, and like I never really thought about it recently. I was like, maybe at some point I wondered if it would happen, and I kind of stopped thinking about it. I mean, it felt a little out of the blue. My second thought was, I can't wait to see what Dylan Field does next, the CEO. I feel like there's two possibilities. He can either stay at Adobe, like with a shot at becoming next CEO, or
Oh, wow.
Just based on his tweets, I'd imagine like a Web3 startup is in the horizon for him.
Wow. That's
I'm
interesting.
guessing. I have no idea, right? But
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of like anger, because it was kind of for years now leading up from like when Figma started to gain popularity, of kind of like the true story of like David and Goliath, and David was like legitimately winning in this, and it was like everyone felt really good about it, and it was this small little startup that started from nothing going against the big players in the game. We had kind of seen Sketch's path forward. They never sold out to Adobe, even though I'm sure that there was like rumors and offers and opportunity to do that. And in my mind, I just thought like, okay, like Figma is going to be the next thing. They're going to start rolling out, maybe a competitor to Illustrator. They already came out with FigJam that's kind of competing with like Miro. Like, what's the next thing that they're going to do? Because whatever they do next is going to be an awesome product. And you just had like, I just had this vision of like, this is their trajectory and this is what they're going to do. And they're going to become, a $1 trillion company or, $500 billion company. And like anything they touch just turns to gold. So I was just like, man, it feels just like they're giving up. Like they're selling themselves short on all this potential.
Yeah. Maybe if the financials weren't like so crazy, but I think like the fact that they paid 20 billion, like by like a financial analysis of like their multiple, last year's revenue was 400 million annual recurring revenue. And so that means they paid a 50 times multiple on last year's revenue, which is like double what other SaaS companies are being acquired for right now, if not more than that. So,
Right.
if it was a 10 billion offer, maybe they'd have said, hey, you know what? Like, that's fine, whatever. But I think with just like the crazy number they threw at them, like, I get it.
I agree. I know. Yes. I think Adobe definitely overpaid for what Figma is today, right? Even if you look at their valuation based off of their fundraising, like in May of 2021, they raised money at a $10 billion valuation there. So like, I think Adobe knew they were overpaying, but like, I keep going back to like when Zuckerberg he went to Yahoo and they're like, yeah, we're just going to offer a crazy amount of money. We're going to offer you $1 billion. And like in his mind, he knew like, even though it was an insane offer at the time, it was like a hard no, just because he knew like 10 steps ahead, he was playing 3D chess and he knew like the trajectory was like not anything that anyone could imagine. So like, yeah, no, I think at this point in time, the valuation was crazy, but like, I don't know. People said the same thing about Instagram when Facebook bought that. They're like, how could you pay that much? How could you pay $1 billion for Instagram? And now it's worth like 50 billion. Like time will tell, but I see both sides of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely strategically valuable for Adobe to just own the entire design space and not have any serious competitors. So like overpaying, I assume, was to just shut out the possibility of competition. And, I mean, I don't know if antitrust is going to have a problem with this, but like, I don't think so. It doesn't seem like the type that'll trigger that.
Yeah.
And beyond just the money that they threw at them, like they must have offered a compelling vision for how they could
right
their mutual visions further. Like whatever Figma's dreams were for the next decade, Adobe must have put together some kind of great pitch of saying, hey, here's how we can help you do that. And if I had to guess, it would be something around AI and 3D design as core competencies that Adobe has built into their products in amazing ways. Just with, machine learning, they've been able to do all kinds of cool things in Photoshop that like before I would need to be an expert to know how to cut someone out of an image or how to like patch up an area of the photo. And now it's like a one click, like just patched, cut, done, like everything's just automated. So they've done some amazing work in AI. They've done some amazing work in 3D design with AR, VR tools. So I'd say looking forward to the next decade of design, Adobe could have put together a really compelling vision for how that could all play together.
Yeah, I'm sure they did not come to them and say, we would like to buy this so that we can sunset Figma in lieu of Adobe XD. That was probably not the vision and hopefully not in the cards for what's to come.
I assume this is the end of Adobe XD, right? Like I just,
that's, yeah.
I was like, oh, it still exists.
That's
like,
the thing.
I forgot that
What's the plan for XD? I think there's a few scenarios, right? Obviously like status quo, keeping it the same. I think another thing that they could do that I think would be bad would be trying to combine them and make some like Figma XD product or an offspring of the two merging. But like, yeah, I don't know. What do you do there?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they might have corporate, customers who are committed to using it for some amount of time. So they can't just like shut it quickly. But I would assume like an end of life plan, some kind of 12, 24 month plan where they're sunsetting it. I can't remember, like, I know Adobe XD was doing some really cool stuff when they kind of launched it. They were trying to go after the interactivity side and make that much more interesting than the competitors were doing at the time. But I don't know, like, where it's at these days. Like, is there some unique differentiator about it, or have they kind of converged?
Yeah, I think so. Like the last time that I used it, there was just like Adobe XD does a lot of really like similar things. And I think they do have the edge on like you can like embed a video into like the prototyping or like a few really, really niche advanced prototyping things that you might find useful, but like they don't have the concept of like pages. So it's just like an open canvas. So it's like any big product that you're working on, I feel is just like kind of not, it can't even really be considered as a tool because like you need just like that layer of organization to be able to like effectively work on a big project. And this was kind of like a staple for XD is like they're like 2 years into their product and they didn't have like drop shadow or like just like some crazy like easy thing. So it was like very weird, like small little product deficiencies that aren't like a big deal in and of themselves. But like, as you're considering like a product as a whole, you're like, this is like, you know, table stakes for what you need to be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, if they do have those advanced prototyping features, I'll assume that like that's part of Adobe's vision for Figma is to say,
Yeah.
hey, like I actually thought about this. I was like, you know, many times in the last 2 years, I'm like, why can't I put a video in here? Like that just seems like so elemental to me. And especially for marketing pages, right? Like in product design, I don't need to do that very often, but in marketing pages, it's becoming such a common trend. And I feel like the need to wait until it's developed for me to feel what that feels like is one of those blocks. So I'd assume for sure they're going to bring that over as soon as they can.
Yeah. So the question is, if you were Adobe, you just acquired this, you see everyone super pissed about it. Adobe kind of has that track record of kind of acquiring different products and I don't want to say ruin them, but for lack of a better term, not seeing the full potential of the product. If you were in kind of the corporate talks or the corporate ranks of Adobe, what would be your strategy to like make this a successful, you know, viable thing going forward?
I would definitely lean into do we integrate AI into Figma as a product? And one of the things I can think about is if you have a design system, and I think there's already been like prototypes and plugins that try to do this, but describe what you want and it'll arrange the components for you. I think that's a really compelling vision that they could make real, and that would entice a lot of designers to say, hey, wow, this is really evolving in a way that, is actually great for me. 3D design, I think, is, one of those things where as we're now starting to move into the AR, VR stage, I've used Adobe Aero and like tried out to just make like simple AR experiences. And, one of the things that you want to be able to do on a product and in a web, UI is to be able to, just say, hey, you can take a look at this thing in AR and like click in and it'll open up on your phone. You can start like looking around that object in 3D. So those are like those things that I think they can start to bring in where people are going to be excited about the direction. I'm going to say, wow, this is something completely new. I never really thought about it, or I did think about it. I just didn't like have the time to embed that into something that I was otherwise working on in this sort of 2D landscape. So, if they can just focus on what that value that they can bring while like not interfering with the core that makes Figma so great, then I don't see that it has to be a bad outcome here. I'd imagine they're bringing a lot more like respect to Figma's vision, Figma's team, and where they want to go. Than if you're acquiring a smaller startup, a smaller product, then I think that's where they tend to get rolled up much more easily.
Yeah, I think like if you compare like Figma, Sketch, XD, and I think if you like evaluate them across a number of different metrics, like personally, I don't think Figma looks as good as Sketch. I don't even think it looks as good as XD from just like a design tool standpoint and like options and layers and things like that. But like the thing that Figma does so much better and has done better for years is just product vision and knowing like what updates are the right updates to pursue and what features are the right features to pursue and put out to the community. And like that is, you know, like the most valuable thing, obviously, when you're a product company, is just like knowing what people want, being able to execute on them quickly, and not releasing just like updates that don't like significantly help. So it's like, I felt for a while when I was using Sketch was like, they were nailing it for like a long time, like probably up through like 2014, 2015. It seemed like everything was good. And then it was like, okay, this is a weird update. Like, who in the world would ask for, you know, for this? And then it also like made everything like way more buggy and it was hard to use. And every update you were just kind of like, you know, crossing your fingers that it didn't break all your plugins and it didn't slow things down. And then it was like all of these
remember those days.
Yeah, it was like no one asked for this. Everyone I forget what it was at the time, you know, what everyone wanted or what I wanted, but it was like no one wants this random thing that you thought was a good idea and spent like a quarter building. But it's like Figma, every time I was like, I didn't even know I needed this. And this is such a good idea. And this like improves my workflow so much. So I think whatever they're doing on the product side, they need to like treat that like the, you know, the golden egg and put, you know, a ton of insulation and very carefully carry that and maintain that.
I saw Kari Saarinen, who used to be on the Airbnb design systems team and is now founder of Linear, who was tweeting about this acquisition. He was talking about how one of the great things that Figma did in its early days was to spend a lot of time with the top design teams in San Francisco that they happened to be around, like his team at Airbnb. And they observed them, they studied them, they worked with them to try to understand, like, okay, you're building out your design system. There's this new concept that's emerging and you're pioneering it. How are you doing it? How are you working with engineering on it? You know, how do you think about the layers of that? And I think that's how they arrived at a lot of that clarity in their kind of overall workflow towards what do professional teams do and how do they do it? I think, you know, your comment on Adobe XD, like that you can't really organize this major file. Once you start to get into a big team and a big product, it starts to kind of break at the seams. You know, that's something that then makes it a disqualifier for like most big companies. And it sounds like Figma, you know, from very early on, like did the hard work of spending time with each of those teams, building the product for them.
Yeah. One thing I would say, that if I was like Adobe's leadership thinking about like next steps, maybe just Figma thinking about next steps, is like, I think anything that we can do to even more so bridge the gap between design and development is a win. Because like currently today, we, you know, you kind of have to maintain like a design system in design. And then ideally you have another design system or component library that's maintained and matured by the developers. And like, if anything changes, you have to talk to the developers have to talk to the designers. And there's a lot of friction. It's a really, really hard problem because there's so many different tech stacks and so many different ways to organize these silos, right? So I think like maybe there are small ways that you can integrate design tokens or colors or fonts that like speak to each other no matter what tech platform they're on, and some sort of integration there. That would be amazing to kind of make at least the visual colors or fonts like be able to interact and update with the code base and with the design system as well.
Well, it is technically possible today. Like with the API, there might even be some plugins that help you do it. You can export like a JSON file from Figma of your styles and then point that to somewhere where your server is going to pick it up and import that theme file. And
sure,
theoretically, you could ship to production. You could change your theme from Figma and ship that to production automatically. So I think it's like technically possible, but just like that feels a bit weird.
Right. Right.
I'd say, yeah, that is still the biggest gap that I feel in our overall design system workflow. Any of the teams I've built design systems on is that lack of an obvious like non-manual connection between the two. But have you ever used Framer? And they have a really
So
interesting vision for it.
yeah, I tried using Framer a few years back, and like when I was getting into it at that point, I was like, it feels legitimately like I could probably just learn how to code in about the same time that it takes me to learn Framer in its current state. And it was just like overly complex and overly hard. And I was like, I could spend all my time learning Framer, and like, who knows if it's going to be around or what it's going to be or whatever. I'm like, if I'm going to spend all this time, I'm going to just like code it or learn how to like develop it from there. But I think they have a really interesting angle, but basically what, like you can code and launch something right from Framer, from like design to website launch, like right within their application.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think and when they relaunched it as Framer X in 2017, I think it was, the idea there was that they moved from a system where you're just sort of prototyping CoffeeScript to a system where you can build React components and then use them in design. I think that was the real like groundbreaking idea.
Yeah.
Which is a bit of a holy grail, and they
Right.
achieved it, but it fell short in a few of the ways you just mentioned. It's like, you don't know about the longevity of the company. There is still a high learning curve. And, for a while I was like, not sure in the long run what would work, Figma or Framer. And, I think we've settled that debate, but there's still that holy grail idea that isn't part of Figma and is part of Framer and is part of
Right.
that way of thought, which is, I don't just want an image of a component that, looks and feels and even has component properties that match everything, but ultimately I, can't actually work. I can't type into this input and then have it filter my search results as a simple example.
Right. Right.
And it doesn't, it looks like it works, but only because I wire everything up very manually to look like it does. And that's very different, I think, in the end. From the more interactive your product is and the more experimental your patterns are, the more you need that in instant real time, like live understanding of exactly how it's going to behave. And that's the beautiful thing about Framer in the way that its vision is like these components and part of the thing they've done to shorten the learning curve is they just have a batch of components that work mostly how you'd want them to work.
Right.
And then you just like affect their properties. So you don't need to code as much to use it well these days. But that idea of like, I pull in an input and I wire it to something, and then I pull in like the results and I make those talk to each other, mostly through like just, no code kind of interaction. Yeah. I'm going to throw out like the crazy idea that Adobe could do next is buy Framer and make them talk to each other.
Right. Right. No, that's totally true. And like even today in Figma, like the inspect panel or when you hand it off to developers, like there's so much unnecessary like attributes and code and styling in there that literally make no sense to ever copy over in any instance. So like if you're clicking on checking out a button on a landing page, like what do you want? You want the size, you want the padding, you want the color of the button, but like what you don't want to grab any element and always have like position absolute on it. Like that is going to just like wreck your designs if you just copy it over one for one. So it's like, I think there's a smarter way to do inspect. And it's like, if the inspect CSS, levels up, I think it's a little easier transition to say like, well, okay, well, what if you just hit import, or what if you just hit like save design system, and then that like goes to someone's server and it takes the applicable CSS, not just like the bogus design system CSS that they fill in there, right? I think there's definitely some improvement on developer handoff, which would hopefully in turn make it not even necessary to do developer handoff or shorten that gap at least.
And Adobe has a history of trying to do this. They've never had anything I think that really clicked, but like Dreamweaver
Right.
was a pretty good product back in the day that you could use to do, publish to web. And maybe there's some skunkworks project deep in Adobe somewhere that could help with this.
Totally. Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Dreamweaver because I remember using that in my early days, and then my friend kind of being like, hey, like Dreamweaver's not cool to use anymore. It's Sublime. You got to move to Sublime. And I was like, how can I work in Sublime if I can't see a preview of what my work is like? And it's like, well, the preview doesn't always match up to the browser anyway, so you should just use Sublime. And now I think all of the like developers are using like VS Code, so it always changes the tools. But yeah, I think this might be an interesting inflection point of like, maybe Figma's not the long-term winner here. Like maybe Framer comes out with something crazy, or like, I don't know, everyone was using Photoshop happily until Sketch came along, and then that like kind of rocked everyone's world. And then Figma kind of took the market from there. It's like, what's next? What's after Figma?
Yeah, I mean, I think Framer has the right idea, but at this point, they're too small. They don't have the distribution advantage. They haven't solved those core problems in a way that can be adopted by a big design organization. So I feel like they have the right idea, but I don't see them necessarily turning it around. I think they've kind of reflected that a little bit in their latest reorientation of their value and their use case towards more like publishing websites rather than designing products.
Right.
So I think they've sort of said, okay, we have this magic sauce of designing with real code components, but the way we're going to use that is, you have a personal site, you have a CMS like blog site, you can do that type of stuff really well here. And I think that's them trying to find a niche that they can exist in.
Yeah. So maybe they're
competing for that territory. Yeah.
Maybe they're more like pivoting towards like competing with like Webflow rather than like a design tool or something. I guess you could call Webflow a design tool. I would maybe call it more of a publishing platform, or I don't even know, but it's definitely different than, Figma, Sketch, XD type of feel from a product perspective.
Yeah.
Well, AK, this has been a great talk. It was super fun to kind of hear about your history, how you got into the space, and talking about the new hotness of the Figma acquisition. I hope Adobe heeds some of your words here, and I hope they don't screw it up. I have confidence in the Figma team. But yeah, this was great. Thank you so much. And I'll leave you with the final words.
Thanks so much, Seth. It was a pleasure to be on here. And I think if there was just like one last like addendum, I would say is one of the really interesting things about this is whenever a large company has an exit, a liquidity event, you also get an outflow of people who absorbed that culture, did really well there, and now possibly have quite a bit of capital to be an angel investor, to be a founder. And I think that's one of the greatest things to come out of here is we potentially have, hundreds of new people who just got unleashed and are, set up to do great design things in this world. I think we saw that at Shopify in Canada, like over the last couple of years, a lot of Shopify people have been investing, founding their own thing. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of this, as much as, it can be a bit scary, but I think there's a lot of good things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point. I forget like what companies, I know LinkedIn, like everyone who was like on the founding team of LinkedIn or whatever went and did crazy things. Same thing happened with like PayPal, maybe even like Netflix. But yeah, like that'd be cool to see like, okay, anyone who started out with Figma is like, gonna go make the next big thing. But that's a pretty cool thought.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on, Seth.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today on the Product Design Podcast. If you enjoyed our conversation, be sure and go follow our guests. Let them know they did a great job and you learned a lot. More to come in the following weeks as we bring on new guests. Please hit that subscribe button so that you will get these podcasts and learn a ton about the product design community. Excited to see you next time. Thanks.